Bore da, croeso cynnes iawn I chi gyd. Hywel Thomas ydw I, Llywydd y Gymdeithas Ddysgedig Cymru. Good morning everyone, a very warm welcome to you all. It's really fantastic to see so many people here and to see those wonderful exhibitions at the back. We're here to celebrate the centenary of Dr. Richard Price, as we all know, and it really is a fantastic event and a fantastic occasion for us. I want to thank Hugh Iranka Davis, Member of the Senedd, for kindly sponsoring this event and for his support in promoting Richard Price this year. Our society, the Learned Society of Wales, is a very young academy. It's the youngest national academy in the UK. I think I'm right in saying, and I'm sure that a couple of fellows here can correct me if I'm wrong, that we're about just coming up to 13 years old. So we're entering the troublesome teenage years. Yes. And we're delighted to have partnered with the American Philosophical Society, the oldest learning society in the United States, to create a transatlantic lecture exchange to mark this really significant anniversary of one of Wales's greatest thinkers. Richard Price was the first Welsh member of the APS, and I'm sure you don't need me to tell you that if he was around today, he would be a fellow of the Learned Society of Wales as well. And we look forward to building on our 21st century connection in the years to come. So I've already mentioned the transatlantic link. Earlier this year, Professor Ewan Morris, a fellow of the Learned Society and Professor of History at Aberystwyth, gave a lecture at the APS which considered the relationship between Richard Price and Benjamin Franklin, two electrifying men who believed in the power of reason to improve the human condition. Today, with the Richard Price 300 Group and the Garw Valley Heritage Society, we welcome Dr. Patrick Spero, librarian and director of the APS Library and Museum, to complete the lecture exchange. Croeso cynnes iawn, Patrick, and I will now hand over to Ewan to introduce our speaker in his lecture, and in so doing, encourage you all to take time to look at the exhibition at the back. It's really just quite fantastic to see the work that's been going on in the Garw Valley, and to see the work of the school children. So, with those words, diolch yn fawr am wrando, thank you for listening, and over to you, Ewan.
Well, diolch yn fawr, Hywel. As Hywel just said, a few weeks ago, I was, I must say, deeply honoured to travel to Philadelphia, representing the Learned Society of Wales, to deliver my lecture on Richard Price and Benjamin Franklin and Joseph Priestley, and celebrate in particular the man whose 300th birthday we're celebrating this year. I gave a lecture to the American Philosophical Society, which is, I will say, the oldest learned society in the United States, founded by Price's friend, Benjamin Franklin. And it's a testament, I think, to Price's and to Wales's role in the American Revolution, that he was a member of the American Philosophical Society. And I think, as we noted at the time, he's still the only Welsh member to date. So after that honour, it's an honour and a pleasure today to welcome Patrick Spero, the librarian director of the American Philosophical Society's Library and Museum in Philadelphia, to offer a lecture in return. Patrick's a leading scholar of the American Revolution, with books including Frontier Rebels, Frontier Country, and the edited anthology The American Revolution Reborn. Today he's going to be exploring for us Price's involvement in the world of radical politics during the latter half of the 18th century, looking in particular at his friendships with Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. I should add an aside here. I was in London last week, and I'd gone to London with my son to see the musical Hamilton. And there's an interesting portrayal of Jefferson, I thought, in the musical. Presumably yours will be somewhat different. But it'll be another reminder to us, I hope, of the central role that Price and Wales had to play in the origins of American independence and the making of the American dream. So, Patrick, over to you.
Well, thank you for those wonderful introductions, and I have to say my children have also been taken by Hamilton, the musical, and if you hadn't had a chance to see it, it is actually a wonderful way to understand this era and the politics of it, and really seems to connect with the younger generation, which I think is really important, because I think understanding our past, I think everybody in this room probably appreciates that, but having the younger generation learn to appreciate it and understand how they can understand their present only by appreciating their past is really important. So if you haven't seen Hamilton and you want to learn a little bit about the American Revolution, I would recommend it. I think it's streaming on various platforms, and I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you again for these the introductions. We had a great time in Philadelphia with Ewan's enlightening talk on electrifying thinkers, and it in fact inspired me to do the talk that I'm doing today. Ewan explored the relationship between Price, Priestley, and Franklin, and looking primarily at their science and the way science and politics merged. So I thought I'd take a little bit of a different tack and explore how Price and his friendships with Franklin and Jefferson tell us a lot about radical politics during this age of revolutions. Now, a little bit about myself that wasn't part of that biography is I actually come from a part of the world where there's a large Welsh presence, cultural presence. I live just outside of Philadelphia, where a number of Welsh Quakers emigrated to in the late 17th and 18th century. So my oldest daughter goes to Kinwood Elementary School in Bala-Kinwood, Pennsylvania. And I live in Marion, and just up the street from us is Bryn Mawr. So there's a prominent Welsh presence around me all the time. And my own background is, as Professor Morris said, in the age of the American Revolution. I've studied Franklin and Jefferson extensively. I've written about both in different ways. And I was familiar with Richard Price, but I have to admit, not as familiar as I should have been. And so the last few months of being immersed in Price and his writing and his life, I've learned a lot. And I'm looking forward to sharing with you some of what I've learned. And I hope it'll be as enlightening for you as it has been for me, or at least interesting for you. And so my goal in the next 40 minutes is to talk about Price's election just briefly to the American Philosophical Society, to put it in its context, and then to talk about his friendship first with Franklin, and then his friendship with Jefferson. And I think studying these pair of friendships really provides great insight into Richard Price's political thought and its evolution during this age of revolutions. So let me first begin with, are my slides? Yep. The American Philosophical Society. We are the oldest learned society in the United States. We were founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1743. We were founded by Franklin as the British colonies were maturing. He realized they needed to create institutions to support civil society. So we founded things like the first public library, the first hospital, the first fire companies. And he'd been to Great Britain. He had seen the Royal Society, and he realized that in 1743, as he wrote in the proposal to create the American Philosophical Society, the first drudgery of settling the colonies is now past. And it was time to create an institution to connect the leading thinkers with each other, to share what they were finding in their homes, and then to share these discoveries with the wider world. So we created the American Philosophical Society, modeled off the Royal Society in London. And it serves its mission then and today in 5 primary ways. The first is to elect members, just like the Learned Society of Wales does, to have meetings of these members, just like most learned societies do, to share what they were learning at these meetings with the wider world through, in the 18th century, the best ways of disseminating knowledge, print. So we have the longest continuously operating scholarly imprint in North America. But we continually now embrace digital publication and dissemination, and also to provide direct support of research through grants. So today we provide over $1.5 million in research grants, primarily to small grants to scholars who need to conduct research in any field of inquiry. It could be science, it could be the humanities. And then, of course, we have the Library and Museum, which is what I oversee. Over time, we've amassed a large research library, over 14 million pages of manuscripts. It takes up over 2.5 miles of shelf space. We have 300,000 volumes. And within these holdings, we have the papers of Benjamin Franklin, about 70 to 80% of his correspondence, and also a large cache of Richard Price manuscripts, some of which I'm going to share with you in a moment. Now, Price's election in 1785 came at a really important moment for the institution, really a transformative moment for the institution, just like the nation. It was just 2 years after the official peace in Paris ended the American War for Independence. And the institution, just like the nation, was trying to establish its foundations. And so the APS, just like the colonies, had to move from being a colonial institution within the British Empire into an institution that represented an independent nation. And so to do that, they had to do two things. The first interesting part of a new nation declaring their independence is that even though they're independent, freed from imperial powers, they also, interestingly, had to often copy European institutions to prove that they're independent. So copying is part of, emulation is part of independence. And so the American Philosophical Society, to prove, to assert itself on the international stage of science, really began to even more so copy the models of the European learned societies like the Royal Society, the French Academy of Sciences. The other way they tried to assert themselves was to elect members from Europe. This was not just going to be an American body, but it had to show itself on the international stage by electing members from all over Europe. And you can see in the year that Price was elected, this is part of that concerted push by APS members to assert themselves on the international stage. So in the year that Price was elected, there were 27 other people elected, 14 of whom came from the United States, but 14, half, also came from Europe, 6 from Great Britain. And in fact, during this period of time, up until about 1800, we've done the math, and about 25% of the APS's membership came from Europe. And to put that in context of today, only 15% of the APS's membership is international. And today, international doesn't just mean Europe, it is global. So the APS's membership was much more international, and it's certainly European in the 18th century. Price was elected alongside his friend Joseph Priestley, William Herschel, also from Great Britain, and then James Madison, Thomas Paine were two from the United States who were elected. Now, I have to be honest and say that, first off, election to APS membership today is secret. We don't know who nominates. We don't know how the election goes. Those records are destroyed. And in the 18th century, I don't know if those records were destroyed as much as a very young institution was not so good at its record keeping. So we don't know who nominated Richard Price to APS membership. But what I can say with near certainty is that it was neither Benjamin Franklin nor Thomas Jefferson. Franklin was in Paris, and had he been involved in this election, there probably would be some record in his correspondence of that. We certainly know that Franklin probably would have supported his election because Franklin was one of the recommenders for Price's election to the Royal Society in 1765. And Jefferson was in the midst of himself traveling to Paris to replace Benjamin Franklin as the chief ambassador to France in 1784, the year in which Price would have been nominated. And Jefferson, at this period of time, knew Price only by reputation. They had not exchanged any correspondence, but Jefferson had certainly read Price's influential pamphlet, Observations on Civil Liberty, that was published in 1776. So I don't think either one of these two central figures in APS history, at this time Franklin was president of the APS, and Jefferson soon became the leading force behind the American Philosophical Society and its new creation in the early republic. I don't think either one of them were involved in his election, but soon, Franklin had known Price for decades and certainly would have supported his election, but soon, in 1785, Jefferson becomes a very close correspondent of Price. And that's what I want to talk about today, is what united these two individuals with Price. And I have to say the answer to why these two became such close friends and correspondents is easy to answer on the face of it. They shared a philosophy that informed most of what they did in their life. And the fundamental piece of that philosophy is that they believed in the power of the people to rule themselves individually and through their government. And that really guided their approach to reform, to society, to politics, to everything. But the harder question is, why did these three come to such a conclusion, to such agreement on these core issues animating the 18th century? And here I think, and here the three are, the two portraits of Jefferson and Franklin actually hang in Franklin Hall. They were overlooking Owen's shoulders as he delivered his talk. The left is a Peel portrait of Franklin, and the right is the last image of Jefferson before he died, done by Thomas Sully. And I'm happy to talk about more of those later if people want to. They have great stories, each one of them. But the reasons that I think they were united, well, there are three parts of their background that they shared. The first, I think as this map shows, is that Franklin, born in 1706 in Puritan Boston, and then moving to Philadelphia, then just a fledgling outpost of Philadelphia, really was born in what was considered the backwater of the empire. 17 years later, Richard Price was born in Tintern, Wales, again on the peripheries of power, even within Great Britain. And then finally, Thomas Jefferson was born in the mountains of Virginia, in Shadwell, far removed from the powers of empire. And so I think the three of them shared a birth and an upbringing in the peripheries of the British Empire, which gave them a particular perspective on imperial power and politics that influenced their thinking in the age of revolutions. The second area in which they all were united was in religion. All three were nonconformist. Interestingly, Franklin and Price shared a very close religious upbringing and evolution. Franklin was raised a Presbyterian in Puritan Boston, which actually made him a double outsider. First, he was born in the colonies, an outsider of the British Empire, but then within his own community, he was a Presbyterian raised in Puritan Boston. So he was a religious outsider as well. He eventually rejected the high Calvinism of his father, the ideas of predestination, that one is born with their soul determined by God, and it didn't matter if you were good or bad, you were either going to be saved or condemned. He rejected that. He talked a lot about how he was driven by a faith that man was to do good in his life, and that mattered. Price himself was born into a dissenting family, Presbyterian, and he too eventually rejected his father's theology and embraced a far more liberal theology. And then there's Jefferson, who's probably the religious thinking is the most elusive of the three. Jefferson was the only one born into the Anglican Church, but he certainly rejected it, and what his actual beliefs were most likely deism. He famously edited his own copy of the Bible, cutting out any mention of miracles in it. So he rejected the divinity of Christ, believing him just a regular human mortal, and that these miracles in the Bible were just superstition that needed to be removed. And this is a very famous Bible that's now held at the Smithsonian, and scholars have studied it and written a lot about it. So all three were dissenters who rejected the state-sponsored Anglican Church, and often probably felt excluded from that, and the power of the church was a frustration for them. And finally, is their science. All three embraced Enlightenment science. And what Enlightenment science and what their approach to science said was that they wanted to overthrow traditional beliefs. They wanted to question received superstitions. They believed that maybe for the first time, man could inquire into and better understand the natural world, what people had thought was God's world. That they could understand it and that they could use their knowledge to improve society and humankind. And that's what drove Franklin, famously with electricity, this phenomenon that seemed to be an act of God, this powerful force. Franklin showed how man could tame it and control it and use it. And Price, in his own work with statistics and demography, showed how he could use math to determine life expectancy. This, again, was something that God should control, life and life expectancy. But here was him showing that the study of numbers, of data, could help man understand and predict the future, and almost like an act of God. And Jefferson himself was most interested in what we call natural history, or understanding the plants and animals of the world, and the belief that the more that we knew about plants and animals, the better we could use this knowledge to improve the productivity of our agriculture. So Jefferson regularly imported species from Europe, from India, from China into American soil with the idea that he could improve agricultural output and therefore make life better for all humans. So they were driven by this idea that man could understand nature and control it and use it to improve their society. So in all areas, they were driven by this idea to empower individuals, to allow them to control their destiny, whether in religion, whether in politics, or whether in science. Now, there is one important difference that I'd like to point out, and that's that their age. Franklin was born in 1706. Price was born in 1723, so 17 years, Jefferson's junior. And then Jefferson was born in 1743, so 37 years, Franklin's junior. And so what Price really did was he served as a bridge to help connect Franklin and Jefferson. And that, in my study for this talk, really helps elucidate or illuminate, I think, Price's evolving political thought, beginning first with Franklin and then transitioning to Jefferson. And so with that, I'd like to start by talking a little bit about his friendship with Benjamin Franklin, and then moving on to Jefferson. So Franklin and Price met in London. They met Shirley met during Franklin's first visit. It wasn't his first visit, but his visit to London from 1757 to 1762. He'd been sent by the colonial Pennsylvania legislature to help lobby the Parliament and the Crown to reform Pennsylvania's government. Not to bore you with too many details about Pennsylvania's peculiar government, but it was ruled by the Penn family. It was a proprietary government. It was something that Franklin believed was a feudalistic, arbitrary form of government in which a family controlled an enormous amount of power within the polity, and he wanted the Crown to reform it. Now, Franklin arrived in 1757 just on the heels of his electricity work, working on electrical experiments. He had, in 1753, received the Copley Medal, which is the highest award given by the Royal Society. In 1756, had been elected a member of the Royal Society. So he arrived to great fanfare. Here's this colonial scientist in the backwaters of America who've just won the greatest award from the Royal Society and been elected to its membership. So Franklin spent these 5 years on a political mission, really most of his time being feted, being wined and dined by the elite of Great Britain. And he spent a great amount of his time not in politics, but actually traveling in scientific circles. And one of those circles brought him to the Club of Honest Whigs, which was a dinner club that met on Thursdays twice a month, eventually in a coffee house outside of St. Paul's. This club was composed of men just like Richard Price. In fact, Richard Price was one of the most prominent members of it, and it's likely that's where they met. There were many dissenting ministers. Many of these dissenting ministers also pursued Enlightenment science. So you can imagine in this period what they were talking about. And James Boswell gave this wonderful quote about what their evenings were like. Some of us smoke a pipe. Conversation goes on pretty formally, sometimes sensibly, and sometimes furiously. At 9, there's a sideboard of Welsh rabbits, rarebit, I assume is what he meant, and apple puffs, porter, and beer served. So you can imagine what their nights were spent like. And we know that Franklin cherished these nights. In fact, when he returned to Philadelphia, one of his first letters back was to thank Richard Price for all the evenings they spent together and his hope that they would meet again sometime. Franklin returns to London in 1764, again on a political mission sent from Pennsylvania. And in this case, he was sent to reform Pennsylvania's government and to actually turn it into a royal government. He believed that the proprietary government needed to be overthrown and replaced by a royally appointed governor, which is important to think about as we talk about the coming of the American independence, that Franklin was actually advocating for more royal control of Pennsylvania, not less, when he first arrived in London in 1764. But once again, him and Price strike up a regular friendship and correspondence. And I think they really cemented their friendship in this period, and they cemented it through the subject of Ewan's talk, Electrifying Thinkers. Joseph Priestley was then just beginning his own scientific work. His first dabbling into science was in electricity. He wanted to write a history of the electrical experiments that Franklin was a central part of. And so he and Price both took on Priestley as a shared mentee. And there's this wonderful exchange between the three, trying to help Priestley write this history of electricity. And in a letter that Priestley wrote to Price, you really get a sense of the collaborative spirit that united Price and Franklin together. And this is what Priestley wrote. Writing upon a philosophical subject to any of you, I would have it considered as writing to all of you. So it really was a very open friendship that he created. And this really served as the foundation for Price and Franklin's friendship. Science, intellectual pursuit, and inquiry into the natural world. However, as we all probably know, politics soon intervened. And their scientific friendship and the revolution that they were supporting soon turned into a political one. Now, Franklin, as you can see in that image, his role really evolved. He changed from being a representative of the Pennsylvania legislature, trying to lobby for a royal colony, to a spokesman for all the colonies, now advocating for less royal involvement in colonial affairs. He was a diplomat who was trying to negotiate a reconciliation between the colonies and the empire and the imperial government in London. And because of that, because he played such a public role, Franklin was very constrained in what he could say. Richard Price was not. Richard Price took a very public position, one that mirrored that of Franklin and of the colonies. And when I read Price's writing, the rhetoric he has really resembles that of colonial pamphleteers. There was really a political bond, even if it was separated by an Atlantic Ocean, between Price and the colonists, that I'm happy to talk about more in the Q&A. So what drove Price in this period, I believe, is that he, like the colonists, first off, believed deeply in the British Constitution, in British principles, and British liberty. What he also believed is that the British Empire had become corrupt. There had been too much luxury. There had been too much wealth created. There had been too much decadence that was corrupting the government and the parliament and the crown and the ministers. And that their attempts to legislate and regulate colonial legislatures that had once been much more autonomous betrayed the constitutional principles that had been guiding the empire up until this point. So from Price's point of view, the real radicals in this period of time were the British Parliament and ministers who were deviating from established practices and norms. And they reflected a corrupt empire. Rotten boroughs were another great complaint of both Price and the colonists. And this really, what he wanted to do was not overturn the British Empire or even radically change it. He wanted to reform it to improve it. Price, like the colonists, like Franklin, I believe, in this period, were driven by a sense of patriotism and allegiance, not rebellion, treason, or sedition. And what Price proposed, something that I think Franklin and the colonists also embraced, was something we might compare today to the Commonwealth system, in which the colonies each would have separate legislatures, in which they would govern themselves, and that's where colonists were represented, but they were united by a shared allegiance to the crown. And that the crown could regulate elements of this empire. The crown may request the legislatures to raise revenue for the interest of the empire as a whole, but it would be that legislature itself that would be governing over the colonists. And this eventually, this negotiation, as we know, eventually broke down. And Franklin returned to Philadelphia, where he signed the Declaration of Independence. And Richard Price continued to be an advocate, now supporting the American independence, supporting very early that the British government should recognize American independence, that a war with America was only going to lead to greater betrayals of the British Constitution, lead the British Empire to take on more debt, which is going to create policies that were only going to further undermine British liberties. And he articulated these views, Richard Price did, in a path-breaking essay called Observations on Civil Liberty that was published in 1776, the same year as the Declaration of Independence. It was widely acclaimed in Great Britain. It sold tens of thousands of copies. He was even given, Price was given the freedom of the city by the London Council, recognizing how widely shared these sympathies were within Great Britain. And I think that's important to remember. Before independence, many Britons sympathized with the colonial cause and had these same concerns about the empire, its structure, and Parliament and the Crown in the way it operated. Americans were also smitten with Price's essay. It arrived first from London, we know, sometime in the spring of 1776. Franklin likely read it before the Declaration of Independence, and it was likely circulating within Philadelphia. But then Americans themselves decided this is such an important pamphlet that we need to publish it as well. So editions were produced in Boston and New York. And in Philadelphia, the first edition was printed on July the 8th by John Dunlap. Dunlap was also the printer of the first Declaration of Independence, which was issued on July the 4th and read in Philadelphia for the first time publicly on July the 8th. Richard Price's Observations on Civil Liberty was released on July the 8th in Philadelphia by John Dunlap. So think about that collision of events, that Dunlap was likely setting the type for the Declaration of Independence at the same time he was setting the type for Observations on Civil Liberty. And my take on Observations on Civil Liberty is that it articulated many of the same ideas that Thomas Paine's Common Sense did. Common Sense came out in January 1776. It sold, historians estimate, 500,000 copies in the colonies, and really many people see as the spur that gave people the freedom to think that they could live without a monarch. It really tore down the monarch. I see Richard Price's Observations on Civil Liberty as what I call the thinking man's common sense. He articulated many of the same principles Thomas Paine did, and I think this quote that I've pulled from it encapsulates not only the spirit of Observations on Civil Liberty, but in many ways, I think, Price's political philosophy more generally. So I'll read it briefly. In general, to be free is to be guided by one's own will, and to be guided by the will of another is the characteristic of servitude. That is particularly applicable to political liberty. That state, I have observed, is free, which is guided by its own will, or by the will of an assembly of representatives appointed by itself and accountable to itself. And every state that is not so governed, or in which a body of men representing the people make not an essential part of the legislature, is in slavery. And so what Price is basically saying here is that the colonies had been enslaved by Parliament and therefore were justified to declare themselves independent. Now Franklin, during this period, travels, his diplomatic role continues. He crosses the Atlantic again, this time traveling to Paris to help negotiate American independence, to help create an alliance with the French. And Price and Franklin continue their correspondence across the English Channel, even though this is very risky for an Englishman like Price to be corresponding with the chief diplomat of the sworn enemy of Great Britain at this time. And what's interesting is in this period of time, Price writes more letters to Franklin. It's a surge in their correspondence. We can track that out. And what Price is trying to do is he's trying to navigate these waters where he is supportive of American independence. And so he's trying to pass information to Franklin that he thinks would be useful for Franklin to understand affairs in Great Britain, the political dynamics of Great Britain, what that might mean for American independence. But he can't cross the line into treason, in sedition. And they acknowledge this in their letters. But one of the things that comes up in almost all of their letters is whether it's Price writing to Franklin or vice versa, is they almost always make mention of the Club of Honest Whigs. And what Price says is that we meet regularly, we think of you fondly. And what I think that is sending to Franklin more than anything is moral support by saying you have a group of friends here in London who still meet, who think about you, but also share your same principles. And so I think Price in this period is playing a very important moral support role for Franklin, even though they can't talk politics because of the dangers that it poses. Now, after the American Revolution, this is where age comes into play. Franklin he's now in his 80s, or nearing his 80s, he begins to enter a stage of retirement. He's removing himself from public affairs. And so he becomes nostalgic, and he starts to write, a series of letters that he's corresponding with Price. He's sharing current events, but much of it is nostalgic. He writes at one point, "I often think of the agreeable evenings I used to pass with that excellent collection of good men," meaning the Club of Honest Whigs. "Perhaps I may pop in some Thursday evening when they least expect me." Of course, he never has a chance to do so, but he's always thinking back on these memories, and that's what he's writing to Price about. And his final letter to Price, written just a month before he dies, I think really captures the extent of their friendship and the bond in which it was formed. And his final letter says, "As we draw nearer the conclusion of life, nature furnishes us with more help, with help to wean us from it, among which one of the most powerful is the loss of such dear friends." And Franklin knows that he was a dear friend of Price, and that he is on his deathbed. And so this is the last note that he writes Price, and he includes in his letter the 2 volumes of the APS's Transactions, symbolically, I think, saying that their friendship was forged and founded in the world of ideas, and Franklin is sending with him the 2 works of the American Philosophical Society that embody that world of ideas and natural inquiry. So with Franklin retiring, that's where Thomas Jefferson enters Price's life. And here, Price, of course, now is still in the prime of his life, and Jefferson is a very young man, deeply engaged in public affairs as well. And the two begin an extended correspondence dealing primarily with politics. So where Franklin, their friendship was forged in science, this one was forged in politics. And in fact, Franklin served as the intermediary between Jefferson and Price. Price had sent Franklin his observations on the importance of American independence. It was published in 1784. He'd sent a packet of these to Franklin in Paris, and Franklin gave a copy to Jefferson. And Jefferson was so taken with it that he used that as an entree to open up a correspondence with Price. And his initial letter really opens up a wide-ranging discussion of politics and their idea of reform. What I have to say is Price and Jefferson were ideological compatriots. They shared a common view on good government. They both feared debt deeply, both of individuals and of government. They believed that luxury corrupts the body politic, and they thought urban centers were sites of decay and immorality. And both believed deeply in the idea of what we call in America the yeoman republic, the idea that democracy is best backed by small individual landowners who own their own farm, were not indebted to anybody but themselves, and therefore could pursue public good freed from any external constraints. And you can imagine how their idea of London and other urban cities embody the exact opposite of that idea. So Franklin begins his correspondence in response to Price's observations on the American Revolution. And what Price had said in there is, first off, he believed that the United States was the greatest hope for the future of mankind. But Price was never completely happy. And so he had his own concerns and critiques of the American experiment, one of which had to do with its form of government. Where Price believed that the British Empire had gotten too powerful, that Parliament had become too powerful and asserted too much authority over colonies. In the American case, he feared that the national government created by the Articles of Confederation was too weak. And because it was so weak, some individual states were going to grow too strong and begin to take over smaller states, much like Parliament had done to the colonies themselves, in Price's view. And so Thomas Jefferson took that and responded. And in Jefferson's response, you have these wonderful views on Jefferson's idea for change in democracy and his own hope in the future of American government. And so what he writes is that, and this is what Jefferson responds to Price's concerns: the happiness of governments like ours, wherein the people are truly mainspring, is that they are never to be despaired of. When an evil becomes so glaring as to strike them generally, they arouse themselves and it is redressed. So through democracy, governments can reform themselves and can improve themselves. And he's comparing that to the more autocratic, monarchical system in Great Britain. So clearly drawing a distinction between these and reassuring Price that reform is possible in a democracy when the people are able to rule themselves. So that letter opens up Price to push Jefferson on perhaps the most controversial and difficult issue facing the United States: slavery. And it's fascinating that Price pulls no punches, is willing to confront Jefferson on what he sees as the contradiction of the American Revolution, that the people who declared liberty were also enslaving others. And Jefferson, of course, is in many ways the embodiment of this contradiction. He's the author of the Declaration of Independence, the authors of the Northwest Ordinances, which said any future states in the Ohio could not have slavery, barred slavery, but also an enslaver of people until his death. So this is what Price says to Jefferson: I shall have reason to fear that I have made myself ridiculous by speaking of the American Revolution in the manner I have done, because it will appear that the people who have been struggling to save themselves from slavery are very ready to enslave others. A very pointed critique directed directly at Jefferson. And what I find fascinating is that Jefferson did not back away. He directly responded to Price, perhaps because Price was in London. Jefferson felt freer to express himself than perhaps if he was writing to a fellow citizen of the United States who might circulate his letter within the United States. And what Jefferson articulates is his view on the future of slavery, which I found absolutely fascinating, but also what I think is a insight into Jefferson's own ambiguity, uncertainty, and personal turmoil with this question. So I'm going to read the quote because I was blown away with it. I'd heard the quote before. I did not realize it was written to Price until I prepared this talk. From the mouth of the head of the Chesapeake, the bulk of the people will approve it in theory, it being abolition, will approve abolition in theory, and it will find a respectable minority ready to adopt it in practice. A minority which, for weight and worth of character, preponderates against the greater number. This is the key part. Who have not the courage to divest their families of a property which, however, keeps their consciences in quiet. That's Jefferson. Jefferson is so indebted himself, is so bound up in slavery, that he cannot free his slaves. And so here he's talking about Virginia planters more generally, wanting to free their slaves, but knowing they can't divest themselves of their property, and that is keeping their conscience in quiet. It's a wonderful perspective on Jefferson. I think absolutely just enlightening. I can't tell you how blown away I was when I was thinking about this in this context. But again, Jefferson reassures Price, and it gives you a sense of where Jefferson sees slavery going. He believes that slavery is on a path to natural emancipation and abolition, and he has faith in democracy and democratic change for doing that. And in some ways, because of people like Price, he believes abolition is going to go away. So in that same letter, he says, the sacred side, that means abolition, is gaining daily recruits from the influx into office. So because of democracy, new people, young men, grown and growing up, are entering office. These have sucked in the principles of liberty, the principles that Price articulated, and it is to them I look with anxiety to turn the fate of this question. Be not therefore discouraged. And Price responds back, again, with hope and optimism based on what Jefferson told him. So Jefferson is this wonderful reporter to Price, and that continues with the next major event that shapes Price's life and the world itself, and that's the French Revolution. If I can change my slide here. So Jefferson is in Paris during the French Revolution, and this becomes a great controversy not only in France, but one that riles the Atlantic world. And the chief question that people on both sides of the Atlantic have to answer is, what is the meaning of the French Revolution? Is it a continuation of the American Revolution? What appears to be this ordered revolution to establish liberty, and some would see as fought to preserve British principles that the British themselves had betrayed? Or was it a deviation from traditions? Was it a deviation from the American Revolution? Was it going to lead to anarchy and terror and chaos? Now, both Thomas Jefferson and Richard Price supported the French Revolution. They both viewed it as a continuation of the American Revolution, and what really they considered and hoped would be the next step in a global movement towards greater liberty and democratic governments. And I think one of the reasons that Price came to this conclusion is because of his correspondence with Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson wrote an enormous amount of letters to Price in the early days of the French Revolution, 1788 and 89. That's the bulk of their correspondence. And Jefferson is conveying almost a daily account of what was happening in Paris. And the picture that he's sending to Price is of this very bloodless, ordered reform, very similar, I would have to say, to ideas of the Glorious Revolution. All right? And that helps influence, I think, Price's early interpretation of the French Revolution, where he famously gives a lecture in 1789 connecting the Glorious Revolution to the French Revolution. And you have to remember in this period that the monarch was still present. There seemed to be reforms that were going to empower the people's estate. It was not the terror and the anarchy that we know came with Robespierre. However, Price nonetheless becomes a whipping post. He becomes the target of attacks. As you can see in this political cartoon, he becomes lambasted in public. He's excoriated in political pamphlets. Edmund Burke takes particular aim at him, and he really becomes ostracized for his views, or at least caricatured by the British elite. And I think this affects him deeply and personally. And so it's in 1788, writing to Jefferson, that Price makes what I consider his personal declaration of independence, and what I think is the logical outcome of his own philosophy, beginning first with Franklin and ending here in October 1788. What he says is, I have learned, and this is in the context of the French Revolution, I have learned to consider myself more a citizen of the world than any particular country. And to such a person, every advance that the cause of public liberty makes must be agreeable. What I think has happened is that Price had become so frustrated living under a government that refused to reform, and that he could see governments in other areas, whether it was in America or in France, able to make these reforms, that he realized that his true allegiance was to ideas and not to nations. That he may have lived under the subjecthood of Great Britain, but he declared himself free of the things that had frustrated him so much. It was a bold, even radical statement, but it was the logical evolution of Price's thinking from when he first met Franklin. What drove Price throughout his life was an unwavering belief that the more liberty individuals possessed, the better off humankind would be. For Price, the power of an individual to choose and control his destiny was the essential tenet that knit his life and philosophy together. He was a dissenter who bristled at the power of established authority, believing individuals should be free to follow their own conscience in order to free their soul. He was engaged in scientific pursuits, once again believing that man should be free to pursue inquiry in order to understand and even master nature. And then he entered the realm of political philosophy, arguing again that man should be free to shape his own destiny by having his hands on the levers of government. Finally, in his letter to Jefferson, he declared that man's allegiances should not be bound by the arbitrariness of where one was born, but instead where his ideas took him. It may have been a radical statement, a formal break from his own country, but it was the natural development of his thought, one that we can trace through his friendships, first with Franklin and then with Jefferson. Thank you. So I think, do I have time for questions?
If I understand correctly, you've agreed to take questions.
I have, yes. I think we have about 15 minutes for questions. I hope that wasn't too long.
Yeah, so I've got a roving mic here, so if you want to take some questions.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Have things really changed when you look at society in America and in this country and people's rights of liberty and equality? Have things changed a lot from then till now?
Great. Have things changed a lot from then to now? Yes. Yes, in terms of power and wealth, right. Well, I think history operates on a continuum, and at different periods it's up and it's down. I do think that in the early Republic, there was an enormous amount of political power that was devolved to the people in a way that did not exist in the British Empire. I certainly, things like indentured servitude was very common in the 18th century. It stopped almost as soon as the American Revolution happened. The franchise, before the American Revolution, it wasn't just being a white man. You also had to own a certain amount of property or have a certain amount of wealth to vote. That slowly is abolished in the early 19th century. So I think that access to power did change dramatically in the United States. Now, I can't speak for Great Britain. What I can say is that traveling around and talking with Hugh yesterday as I got to see the Welsh countryside, ideas of devolution sound a lot like what Price was articulating and advocating. And I have to say, I have a longer essay that's going to get published along with Ewan Morris's talk, but I think his upbringing in Wales influenced his thinking greatly. Ideas about exclusion and being on the peripheries of power shaped his thinking. So I think ideas about devolution also have resonances with Price's own thinking. Thank you.
Marianne?
Diolch yn fawr. That was a wonderful lecture.
Yeah,
Thank you very much. I'm struck by how powerful the relationships are between these men, and you evoke very nicely that the fug of the smoke and the Club of Honest Whigs. Jefferson and Price, do they ever get a chance to meet? And can you say something about the strength of relationships in 18th century correspondence between like-minded people? Because it's one of the nicest things about the period, I think.
Yeah, and absolutely, and that is something I talk about in my what I hope will be the article that's published. They never meet, at least as far as I can tell. Jefferson does go to London, but I don't think their circles overlap. But this is very common, this world of letters, and it's an Atlantic phenomenon. And one of the things that I was struck by, that I have been struck by before this, but I think Richard Price embodies it, is that there really is this Atlantic community on both sides, in North America, in Great Britain, and in France eventually too, that are part of this reformist agenda. And this political body before the American Revolution are connected, whether it's in Boston, whether it's in London, whether it's in parts of France and Europe. And how is it connected? It's through letters and correspondence. And these letters are just a wonderful. I mean, it's like voyeuristic, and they have a formula to them. You know, there's usually an introductory paragraph about how somebody's doing, and then they get to the heart of the matter, and then a nice concluding thought. So no, it was a friendship forged entirely in correspondence. It's similar today how people may have friends. I'm not on Twitter, but there's parallels to today, whether it's through Facebook, whether it's through early in the 2000s, the idea of blogging reminded me a great deal about 18th century news and correspondence. The idea of these bloggers who would then copy each other's blogs and respond to and react to. So there are elements of the 18th century, I think, that are even our digital media has resurrected. So, thanks.
Thank you.
Could you introduce yourself, please? I just want to be quite nice just to know to speak in. If the question is just introduce themselves.
Okay, sorry. So I was Mary Ann Constantine from the Centre for Welsh and Celtic Studies in Aberystwyth.
Okay.
Sorry. Hi, I'm Rhys Good. I'm the Cabinet Member for Future Generations in Bridgend County Borough Council, where Richard is originally from. And I guess expanding on Roger's first question, what do you think Price's reaction would be, and Jefferson and Franklin's reaction for that, to the sort of new power that has emerged over the last few years of sort of the uber wealthy of Zuckerberg and Amazon and Twitter, etc. And how do you think they would react to that sort of almost new second estate?
Yeah. So, when I read Price, you can't help but think about today and the concentrations of power. I think, going back to the United States, there are a lot of questions about representation in the United States, really important ones. As you know, the United States is extremely divided. And that if you look at our House of Representatives, the incumbency is remarkable. It's like over 90%. And, most legislators are more likely to face a challenge from within their party in their district than from the other party. And that's not the way it used to be. There's been this attempt at gerrymandering, and both parties do it. I mean, this is on both sides. And what this is forcing are, I think, the parties to move into more extremes, because legislators are more worried about getting challenged from the extreme wing of their party because they're not worried about their general election, And so I can't help but think of how rotten boroughs were a real concern of Price and others in this day, in that age. So representation is a huge issue in the United States, one that I think Price illuminates. And of course, there are fears about the ways in which not just concentrations of wealth, but what wealth does to a society more generally. And I think the idea of celebrity and the way that this sense of luxury can also corrupt not just those who have wealth, but those who try to follow it and mimic it, and sometimes maybe have to take on unnecessary debt. Because debt is really Price's greatest fear. The idea that if you're in debt, whether an individual or a nation, you are then circumscribed in what you can do. And I think Price, more than anything, says the British national debt is why they had to break their constitution and infringe on colonies, because they needed new revenue coming in. And when you look at, I can't speak to Great Britain's debt. I assume it's large like the United States. But but you can. I mean, when people project out on the future of the United States, this debt is going to put real constraints on what we can do. So I can't tell you how when I read Price, it just resonates. And so that, thank you for that question.
You mentioned Price's concerns over the state. Over the manner of governance in the new American polity. So what was the breadth of vision that Price had with regard to his desire to see what kind of government in the American polity, and also, of course, in the United Kingdom? What exactly did he want, and what did Franklin, Jefferson, and Price want as an outcome in France? And how did their views change over time with regard to the manner in which, of course, it changed very radically, the developments in France?
Those are very big questions. I'll try to answer them briefly. So in North America, what Price really wants to see is a federal body that can help mediate between state rivalries and to be able to represent national interests. And what he's concerned about is the Articles of Confederation don't have the powers necessary to do that. I don't think he's necessarily anticipating in 84 the U.S. Constitution, but I do believe he supports the Constitution when it's adopted. But he is seeing a more empowered federal body that can better assert itself. I won't get into the details of the Articles of Confederation, but essentially the national government in this period had virtually no powers, meaningful powers. In Great Britain, he wants a reform of representation. He also believes, and this is what I think is a very important point of his understanding of history and the colony's place in it and the empire more generally. He basically says that when the colonists settled in North America, they brought with them all the rights of British subjects. They also received royal charters, and under those charters they created legislatures. And those are the legislatures that represented them. And that was how the empire was structured. And that's essentially how it ran until the 1760s, when Parliament begins overreaching and intruding on those rights. So what I think Price is saying in terms of the empire, it needs to return to the status quo that it had before, while Great Britain's representation needs to reform itself through better representation. And for the French Revolution, I mean, I think in that early period, Price is hoping for believing in that it's going to be like the American Revolution and maybe even less violent. Let's see. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you. Am I competing?
Sorry. You got a follow-up quickly? Yeah, I don't know that he, I can't answer that with absolute certainty, but my impression is that he did not want a major reform of the British government per se. What he wanted to do was make sure that there was no rotten boroughs. He was concerned that George III, and this was a concern that the colonists eventually adopted, had become a far more assertive monarch in the role of the Parliament. Of course, the king had the right to appoint a prime minister, and during this period of time, George III rolls through prime ministers, almost every year. And so one of the things about the American Revolution I often talk about is the instability within Parliament is important. Also, the king being so assertive, or apparently assertive in Parliament, I think makes Parliament more insecure, which influences, this is a side tangent, but here they have a more assertive king, and Parliament themselves are saying, what's our authority, what's our power? So when it comes to the colonies, they want to assert their power to prove that they have it in some ways in relation to the king becoming more assertive within their parliament. So that's how I think he approached the UK.
Shall we move on?
Yep.
I did want to say once again, welcome to the children from the schools. Just arrived.
Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah.
I was struck by the influence of theology on Price's thinking, and in particular, liberal theology you were mentioning. Does that liberal theology have a name? Where did that emanate from? The sort of Carmarthenshire?
Yeah. Well, I actually I'm not much of a religious historian, to be honest. I am a political historian. So, but he was Arminian. I think he himself did question the kind of the divinity of Christ, and he did reject predestination, which was very that was a part of the Enlightenment science and Enlightenment religion, was questioning the idea of this supreme being who was the determinant of everything in the world, including your soul. And famously, and Paul Frame writes about this is the biographer of Price himself, he was sent to a school that actually taught liberal theology, and his father was a high Calvinist himself, and so when his father learned what he was being taught, he pulled him out of the school and sent him to another one. So, yeah.
I was wondering, because obviously last week the leading candidate for the Scottish National Party got himself into order by taking a different view, non-liberal.
Okay.
One last question, I think. Yeah. So, who's this gentleman? Oh, Professor John Tucker. Here you go.
Thank you very much. I've been introduced now, it seems. My first comment about debt, which is that Price's extensive mathematical researches and work is geared up for improving the lot of ordinary people through protecting them from destitution in a financial insurance system that didn't work. These companies were coming and going, and they were in debt and could not meet the annuities and all the things that were promised. So the revolution that we symbolize by the equitable life, inevitably associated with Price and Morgan and the family, so to say, as scientific advisors, is a very important matter. So debt was like everywhere somehow. Simple question. Can you comment on why Richard Price is not better known? So much so, and I'm putting you on the spot here, that even a distinguished historian of the revolution, such as your good self, comes anew to the man and his life.
Yeah. Thank you. So,
and by the way, what are the prospects for the future?
Yeah. First of all, what I will say is I think what drove Price in everything, on your first comment, was a sense of Christian charity. He was a Christian, devout throughout his life. And I think what compelled him was an idea that he wanted to improve society. And that is actually, we think about life insurance today, not in the way that it transforms society, and his ideas about supporting widows and the poor through financial mechanisms you could understand and predict was transformative. In fact, Franklin, when he read it, Franklin himself was a demographer interested in insurance, said that Price's work on it was one of the most profound things to have happened in this age. So it was extremely important. Almost, in some ways, it's so, and this might get to your question, why is Price not better known? Well, life insurance just seems to be so obvious today. The fact that it took a brilliant mind to figure out the math and statistics behind it just seems so distant and foreign and abstract from it. And more generally, I've been thinking about that. Why is Price not better known? Well, in part because maybe within Great Britain, he was an outsider. He supported the American independence and the French Revolution. He was critical of the British Empire. So within his own age, he was he was ostracized and excluded. And where his ideas maybe had the most power and impact were in countries where their heroes, they wanted to celebrate their own heroes. So the irony may be that Price was born on the periphery, and that influenced his thinking and influenced people on the peripheries to declare themselves independent and get more power. But it also meant that because he himself had moved to the metropole, died still on the periphery in some ways. So,
Thank
you.
Not only giving the lecture, but taking all these questions. And I know I don't need to say anything about how interesting your lecture has been. Just the number and range of questions speak for themselves.
Yeah.
Job of our hour.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all.